She hurled the tablet across the hospital room so hard it shattered against the wall. Nurses didn't flinch. They'd stopped flinching weeks ago. Lydia Cross, daughter of a billionaire, once the youngest executive at Cross Tech, sat in her wheelchair, chest heaving, tears streaming down a face that had stopped asking for help. She couldn't hear the crash. She couldn't hear anything anymore. And the silence that filled her world wasn't peaceful. It was a grave. Her father had spent $4 million trying to fix her. Every specialist, every therapy, every machine. And not one of them had thought to simply speak to her. But that night, a janitor did. What city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. The fluorescent lights in room 412 at Mercy General Hospital hummed in a frequency that Lydia Cross would never hear again. She knew they hummed because she used to feel the faint vibration when she pressed her fingers to the wall. She used to do a lot of things. She used to run board meetings. She used to close deals with a handshake and a single, well-timed sentence. She used to walk into a room and feel every head turn. Now she sat in a wheelchair at the center of a room that cost her father $1,200 a night, and she felt nothing except the kind of hollow rage that lives just below the ribs and never really leaves. The tablet she'd thrown, the one the speech therapist had loaded with communication apps, little icons and buttons meant to help Lydia express herself, lay in 3 pieces near the window. Nobody came to pick it up. Not yet. Her night nurse, a kind-faced woman named Sandra, who had learned early on not to make eye contact for too long, slipped in around 9:30 to check vitals. She smiled the specific smile that people use when they don't know what else to offer. Lydia watched her mouth move. She didn't bother trying to read the words. She turned her face toward the window. Sandra left. Lydia was 34 years old, and she had decided, in the slow and terrible hours of the past 3 weeks, that she was done. Not dramatically, not in the way people imagine when they picture someone at rock bottom. She was done the way a fire goes out, not with a great extinguishing rush of water, but with the quiet, gradual exhaustion of fuel. She had simply stopped wanting morning to come. The accident had been 7 weeks ago. A wet road, a distracted driver running a red light. Lydia's car, she'd been driving herself home from a late meeting, something she'd done 1,000 times, hit broadside at 40 miles an hour. The spinal compression had been severe. The surgeons had been cautious in their language, speaking to her father in the hallway while Lydia lay in the ICU attached to machines. Partial paralysis, lower extremities. We'll know more in time. What they hadn't caught, not until the 2nd week, was the damage to the auditory nerve. Both sides. Complete sensory neural hearing loss. Permanent. Her father had called in every specialist he knew. Victor Cross was not a man who accepted permanent, but permanent didn't negotiate with billionaires. The hearing was gone. The walking. For now. The doctor still said for now, though Lydia had stopped believing in for now, was gone. And something else had gone with it. The thing inside her that had always pushed forward, always found the next angle, always believed the next move was possible. That thing had gone quiet too, and in its absence, there was only the hum she couldn't hear, the lights she was tired of looking at, and the growing certainty that she had already been the best version of herself she was ever going to be. Victor Cross visited every day at 6 in the evening. He was 61, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he'd been built to occupy space in a room. He'd started Cross Tech in a garage in 1989 and turned it into a $12 billion enterprise. He had survived hostile takeover attempts, 2 congressional hearings, a divorce, and the death of his own father. He was not a man given to helplessness. Lydia watched him become helpless in real time, and she didn't know if that made her feel better or worse. He would sit in the chair beside her bed and talk to her. She could see his mouth moving. He hadn't learned to face her fully when he spoke, and he talked too fast, and the words blurred together in ways she couldn't always decode. Sometimes she caught fragments. "The team is asking for you," Dr. Rashid says. "The physical therapist thinks." She nodded. She looked out the window. One evening, 3 weeks in, he had reached across and taken her hand. She felt the grip, firm, the way it always was, the handshake grip he'd never quite turned off, even with his own daughter. And she looked at his face and saw something she had never seen there before. He was terrified. She pulled her hand back, not because she was cruel, because she was exhausted, and his fear felt like one more thing she was supposed to manage, and she had nothing left to manage anything with. He left that night earlier than usual. She didn't watch him go. She had tried the sign language instructor. Her father had hired a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, certified in ASL, gentle, patient, experienced with late deafened adults. Lydia had sat across from her for 40 minutes during their first session, and then written on the notepad. She still wrote sometimes, when she couldn't stand watching people fumble through mouthing words at her. "I don't want to learn a new language. I want my old one back." Dr. Nair had nodded slowly. She'd written back, "I understand, but your old language isn't gone. It's just changed shape." Lydia had torn the page off the pad, folded it once, and set it face down on the tray table. Dr. Nair had not come back for a second session. The occupational therapist had lasted longer, 6 sessions, before Lydia's silence and stillness had made the woman visibly uncomfortable enough that she started finding reasons to cut sessions short. The psychiatrist, a colleague of her father's who owed Victor a favor, had sat across from Lydia with a legal pad and written questions in large block letters. "On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your mood today?" Lydia had looked at the question for a long moment. Then she'd written, in small, precise letters, "What scale goes below 1? He'd flagged her chart, recommended closer monitoring. Victor had hired a private night attendant, a large, quiet man named Jerome, who sat in the corner of the room and scrolled his phone and did not bother her except to hand her water every few hours. She didn't mind Jerome. He didn't try to fix her. It was Jerome's night off when Ethan Moore first knocked on the door of room 412. She didn't hear the knock, of course. What she saw was the door opening slowly, and a man she didn't recognize leaning his head in, with an expression she had not seen on anyone's face in 7 weeks. Not concern, not pity, not the careful professional neutrality of someone being paid to check on her. He looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure he should be there. He was white, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that had been lived in. Not hard, but not soft either. The kind of face that had clearly seen some real weather. He was wearing the gray uniform of the hospital's facility staff, and he had a mop handle hoisted over one shoulder. He was a janitor. On the night shift. Lydia watched him take in the shattered tablet on the floor. Then he looked at her. She lifted her chin. What? He didn't mouth anything. Didn't reach for the notepad on her tray table. Didn't pull out a phone. Instead, he raised one hand, slowly, palm out. Not a wave, something more deliberate. And he signed 2 words. "You okay?" Lydia Cross had not moved quickly in 7 weeks, but something in her body reacted before her mind caught up. Her spine straightened. Her eyes locked onto his hands. She knew what those signs were. She knew them because she had spent 3 weeks watching ASL tutorial videos at 2 in the morning on the nights she couldn't sleep. Not because she wanted to learn, but because some stubborn, wounded part of her kept trying to understand the world she'd been dropped into. She hadn't spoken a word of it to anyone. She hadn't wanted to give anyone, her father, the therapists, the nurses, the satisfaction. But she knew those 2 signs. She looked at the man in the doorway for a long moment. Then she signed back. No. He didn't come in, not that first night. He picked up the pieces of the broken tablet from the floor. She watched him crouch down, gather them carefully, set them on the window ledge rather than in the trash, as if he wasn't sure whether she wanted them gone or just out of the way. Then he looked at her again. He signed, "I'll come back tomorrow, if that's okay." It wasn't a question the way the doctors asked questions. It wasn't the therapeutic we of the therapists. It was just a man asking a woman if tomorrow was okay. She didn't sign yes. She didn't sign no. She just turned her face back to the window. He left. She sat in the dark for a long time after that, her right hand resting in her lap, her fingers moving in the smallest possible motions, tracing the shapes of the 2 signs she'd sent back to him. No. It was the first real thing she'd said to anyone in 3 weeks. His name, she found out the next night, was Ethan Moore. He came back at 10:45 after the last rounds, when the ward was quiet and the lights in the hallway had dimmed to their nighttime setting. He knocked. She felt the faint vibration through the floor, the slight movement of the door, and she was already facing it when he opened it. He had brought 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall. He held one up, questioningly. She hesitated. Then she pointed at it. He came in, set it on her tray table, pulled the chair Jerome usually sat in a few feet closer, not too close, and sat down. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at her. She waited. He signed, slowly and carefully, clearly someone who had thought about what he was going to say. "My name is Ethan. I've been working nights here for 2 years. I should have knocked sooner." Lydia watched his hands. Then she reached for the notepad on her tray table and wrote, "Why didn't you?" He read it. He thought for a moment. Then he signed, "I didn't think it was my place." She wrote, "What changed?" He was quiet for a second. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. Then he signed, "I heard you threw a tablet." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. And that almost was the first time something inside her chest had moved in that direction in a very long time. She wrote, "It wasn't working." He looked at that, and his mouth curved slightly. Not a grin, something quieter. He signed, "I believe you." He came back the night after that, and the night after that. They didn't have long conversations, not in the beginning. His signing was good, not perfect, but good, confident in its imperfection, the way someone signs when they've used it with someone they loved rather than in a classroom. She noticed that. She noticed that he didn't hesitate over the signs the way people did when they'd learned something academically. He signed the way people talk when they don't have to think about talking. On the 4th night, she wrote, "Where did you learn?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the question, and something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly, but the particular heaviness of something that has already been mourned and is now carried instead. He signed, "My wife. She lost most of her hearing when she was 29. Cancer treatment." A pause. "She passed 3 years ago." Lydia looked at his hands after they stilled. Then she looked at his face. She wrote, "I'm sorry." He nodded once. Not the performed nodding of someone accepting condolences at a funeral, just an acknowledgement. Then he signed, "She was the one who made me get good at it. She said she wasn't going to spend 20 years watching me struggle through conversations." Lydia read that. She read it again. She wrote, "She sounds like she was practical." He smiled. A real one, unguarded. She really was. On the 6th night, Lydia told him what she hadn't told anyone. She signed it, not wrote it. It felt important. She couldn't have explained why, that this particular thing be signed and not written down on paper where it could sit and be permanent and real in the way written things are real. She signed, "I've been thinking about stopping." He looked at her hands. He didn't recoil. He didn't immediately reach for the call button. He sat very still and looked at her, and then he signed, "Stopping what?" She held his gaze. She signed, "Everything." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he signed, "Can I ask you something first?" She waited. "What was the last thing you did that felt like it was yours, before all of this?" The question was not what she had expected. She had expected alarm, or a careful, therapeutic response about resources and crisis lines. She had expected to be handled. She thought about the question. She thought about it for a long time. Then she signed slowly. "I was redesigning the interface for our accessibility software, the version we built for low vision users. I stayed at the office until 2 in the morning, getting the navigation flow right." He signed, "Why'd you stay that late?" "Because the consultants we brought in kept designing for the average user, and I knew that wasn't right. I knew what it needed to feel like, and I couldn't leave until I got it." He nodded slowly. Then he signed, "That sounds like someone who gives a damn." She looked at her hands. She looked at his face. She signed, "That was a different person." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and signed back, "Or the same person who just had everything she knew ripped away from her and hasn't had a single person in 7 weeks talk to her like she's still in there." Lydia Cross had been sitting in that room for 7 weeks. She had been evaluated, assessed, monitored, medicated, and carefully managed. She had been looked at with concern and with worry and with the specific pity of people who knew her before and were struggling with the distance between then and now. No one had said, "You're still in there." Her eyes filled. She turned her face away fast, toward the window, the way she always did when something tried to break through. She pressed the back of one hand against her mouth. She felt the faint vibration of his chair shifting. He didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He just waited. After a moment, she turned back. She signed, "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question honestly. Then he signed, "Because I know what it looks like when someone's been alone in a way that doesn't have anything to do with how many people are around. And I've got a daughter. She's 9. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what I would want someone to do if she were ever—" He paused. "In a place like this." She watched his hands settle. She signed, "What's her name?" "Gracie." "Does she know sign language?" He smiled, and it was the most genuine thing she'd seen in the longest time. "She's better than me. She learned it to talk to her mom in the last year." Lydia looked at that for a moment. Then she wrote on the notepad. Some things were still better written. "Tell Gracie she sounds like someone who gives a damn." Ethan Moore read that and laughed, quietly, so as not to disturb the ward, but a real laugh, full and unguarded. Lydia looked at him, and for the first time in 7 weeks, she let herself feel something other than the gravity of stopping. It was small. It was fragile. It was the most uncertain thing she'd ever held. But it was something. She didn't sleep that night, but it was different from all the other nights. The previous nights, the wakefulness had been the absence of will, lying still and waiting for morning because there was nothing else to do and not enough desire left to do otherwise. This night, her hands were moving. She practiced the signs she knew, the small vocabulary she'd built alone in the dark over 3 weeks of videos and silence. She shaped words in the air above her blanket, slowly, then faster, then slowly again, the way Ethan's hands moved when he was being careful. She signed, "I'm still in there." She signed it again. She held her own hands in front of her face in the low light of the hospital room, and she looked at the shapes they made. And she thought about a woman she'd never met, who had lost her hearing at 29, and made her husband get good at signing, because she wasn't going to spend 20 years watching him struggle. She thought about a 9-year-old girl named Gracie, who had learned a language to talk to her dying mother. She thought about accessibility software, about a navigation flow that needed to feel right, about the things she'd been trying to build before a wet road and a red light had changed the shape of everything. She turned her head toward the window. The city was still out there. The lights were still on. It was 3 in the morning, and somewhere out there a 9-year-old girl was asleep in a house with a father who mopped hospital floors at night and had learned to sign because he'd loved someone enough to show up in whatever language she needed. Lydia Cross closed her eyes, and for the first time in 7 weeks, she wasn't waiting for morning. She was waiting to see what morning would bring. Morning came the way it always does, indifferent, unhurried, without any particular regard for the people waiting on it. Lydia was awake when the first gray light began to press against the window. She'd been awake for most of the night, but it was a different kind of awake than she'd known in the weeks before. Less like drowning, more like floating, uncertain of the current, uncertain of the shore, but no longer certain she wanted to go under. Sandra came in at 6 to take vitals. Lydia watched her move through the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And when Sandra reached for the blood pressure cuff and glanced at her face, that careful, braced glance the staff had all developed, the one that was really a question: how bad is it today? Lydia did something she hadn't done in 7 weeks. She nodded, just once. A small, deliberate nod that meant, "I'm here. I'm okay." Sandra's hands paused for just a second. Then she smiled, not the performance smile, the real one, and finished the reading. Lydia looked at the number on the monitor. Normal. Her body, at least, was functioning. She thought, that's something. She hadn't thought that's something in a long time. Victor arrived that evening at 6, same as always, and something stopped him 2 steps inside the door. He stood there, coat still on, and looked at his daughter. Lydia was sitting up straighter than she had been. She had asked Sandra that morning to help her wash her hair, which she hadn't cared about in weeks. She had the notepad in her lap and a pen in her hand, and she had been writing. Not the single-word responses to medical questions, but actually writing, filling half a page in the small, precise handwriting she'd had since college. Victor sat down slowly in the chair beside her bed. His eyes went to the notepad. He didn't ask what she was writing. He knew better than to ask questions she'd turn into walls. She looked at him. Then she wrote something and turned the pad so he could read it. I want a whiteboard, a big one, for the wall. He read it. He looked up at her. She could see him trying to find the right response, trying not to say the wrong thing, the way he'd been doing every night for 7 weeks. He said. She read his lips slowly. Okay, I'll have one here tomorrow morning. She turned the pad back, wrote again, turned it. And I want to go outside. In the chair. Tomorrow. Before the PT session. He nodded. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was feeling something he didn't know how to hold. I'll make sure someone takes you. She wrote, I'll go alone. He hesitated. She watched the hesitation move across his face, the reflex of a father, the instinct to say, you can't, it's not safe, let someone go with you. And she waited to see which version of him would win. He said, okay. It was the best thing he'd said to her in 7 weeks. She didn't tell him about Ethan. She didn't know why exactly. It wasn't that she was hiding anything. It was more that what had happened in this room over the last 6 nights was the first thing in 2 months that had belonged entirely to her. Not arranged by her father, not scheduled by a therapist, not funded by anyone. Just a man with a mop and a coffee and his late wife's language, knocking on a door he wasn't sure he should knock on. She wanted to keep it that way for a little while longer. Ethan came at 10:45, as he had every night that week. She had the whiteboard request on the notepad ready, not for him, she'd already written it for her father. But she was thinking about the list she'd started making, the page she'd been filling when Victor arrived. She had written down, in order, the things she remembered caring about. The accessibility navigation flow. A board presentation she'd been developing on adaptive technology markets. A hiring decision she'd been putting off. The name of an engineer on her team, Marcus Webb, who had been working on a project she'd greenlit 6 months ago that she hadn't checked in on since the accident. They were small things, work things, but they were hers. Ethan came in, checked the room for thrown objects out of what she suspected was genuine habit now, and pulled the chair to its usual position. He'd started bringing tea instead of coffee after she'd left the coffee untouched 3 nights running. He set the cup on the tray table and signed, "How was today?" She considered. Then she signed, "Different." Different how? She thought about how to say it. She signed, "I made a list." He tilted his head. "What kind of list?" "Things I haven't given up on yet. Things I didn't know I still had." He was quiet for a moment, reading her hands. Then he signed, "That's the first list." She raised an eyebrow. "What's the second list?" "The things you're going to add to it." She looked at him. She signed, "You're very sure of yourself for a man who mops floors at 11 p.m. He laughed, the low, genuine laugh that she decided she liked, that felt like something steady in a room full of unstable things. He signed, "I mop floors at 11 p.m. specifically so I can have conversations like this one." She shook her head slowly, but she was almost smiling, and they both knew it. She picked up the notepad and wrote, because some things she still preferred to write. "Tell me about Gracie." He looked at the words, and something in his face opened up the way a room does when someone finally turns on a lamp. He leaned back in the chair, hands resting on his knees, and he signed with the ease of someone talking about the best thing in their life. "She's 9, going on 45. She corrects my signing. She has opinions about everything. What I cook, how I fold laundry, whether the TV remote belongs on the left side of the couch or the right side." He signed this with the exasperated affection of a man who had been corrected about the remote many times. She reads constantly. She likes stories about people who figure things out. Detectives, scientists, that kind of thing. Lydia signed. She sounds like she thinks for herself. She does. Sometimes it's exhausting. Mostly, it's the best thing about her. He paused. Then he signed, "She worries about me." Lydia watched his hands settle. She wrote, "Does she know where you work at night?" He nodded. "I told her it's a hospital, that I help people feel better." A pause. "She asked me how a janitor helps people feel better." Lydia looked at that. Then she wrote, "What did you tell her?" His hands moved carefully. "I told her that when a place is clean, people can breathe easier. And when someone's having the worst night of their life, sometimes knowing someone else is still moving through the building, that life is still going on around them, that helps too." Lydia stared at those words for a long moment. She signed, "Gracie should know her dad is good at this." He looked at her. "Good at what?" She signed, "Showing up." He didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, then back at her, and she could see that she'd landed somewhere real with that one, somewhere he didn't usually let people land. He nodded once, the same way he had when she'd said she was sorry about his wife. Not performed, just received. 2 weeks later, the whiteboard was covered. Victor had delivered it the morning after she asked. A 6-foot commercial whiteboard, mounted on the wall across from her bed. He had said nothing about what it was for. He had just had it installed and left. It was covered now in a system Lydia had developed on her own over the past 2 weeks. On the left side, a flow diagram she was rebuilding from memory of the Accessibility Navigation Project. On the right, a list of names and questions she needed answered. In the center, written in large letters and underlined twice, a single phrase she had put there on the 3rd day of having the board and had not erased. What does it need to feel like? It was the question she'd been asking when she'd stayed at the office until 2 in the morning before the accident. It was her question, the one that had always separated her work from the work of people who built things for the average user. Ethan stood in front of it one night, mop forgotten against the wall, studying it with his hands on his hips. He turned and signed, "This is a lot of thinking." She signed, "It's been a slow week." He pointed at the central phrase. What does it need to feel like? What is it? She moved her chair closer to the board. She pointed to the flow diagram. Software, for users who are deaf or hard of hearing. We had a version, but it was designed by people who were designing for an imaginary user. Somebody average, somebody they'd never actually met. She paused. Then she added, "I know what the real user needs now." He looked at her, then at the board, then back at her. Because I'm her now. The room was quiet. Not the heavy quiet it used to be. The quiet that used to press against her like a weight. This was a different kind. The kind that settles after something true gets said. Ethan signed, "That's going to be a different product." "Yes," she signed, "it is." He nodded slowly. He looked at the board one more time, then back at her, and she could see in his face the particular expression of someone watching something they weren't sure they'd see. Not pity, not relief, just the simple acknowledgement of a turn. He signed, "Your people at the company, do they know you're doing this?" She shook her head. "My father thinks I'm in occupational therapy." He looked at her with one eyebrow raised. "And what are you actually doing?" She looked at the board. "Building something that matters." She called Marcus Webb the next morning. Not called, texted, through the hospital's patient communication tablet. a new one that she'd actually kept in one piece. Marcus was the engineer she'd been thinking about since the night she made the first list. He had been on the accessibility project for 2 years. He was good. Not the flashiest developer on the team, but thorough. The kind of programmer who tested edge cases because he actually cared whether the thing broke, not because a project manager told him to. She typed, "This is Lydia. I know it's been a while. Where are we on the nav flow for the hard of hearing module?" It took him 40 minutes to respond, which told her he'd probably panicked slightly and gone back through his notes before answering. His response: "Ms. Cross, really glad to hear from you. We paused it after we weren't sure of the direction without your input. Everything's still there. I've been keeping notes on things I think we got wrong." She typed back, "Send me the notes." He sent them within the hour. She read through them on the tablet. 12 pages, detailed, honest, the notes of someone who had been paying attention even when no one was asking them to. She read a section where Marcus had written, "The current design assumes the user is cognitively undisturbed and physically mobile, except for the hearing loss. This is almost never the real situation. Real users are dealing with multiple things at once. We need to design for a person, not a condition." She read that sentence 3 times. She took a photo of the whiteboard and texted it to Marcus. He responded, "Oh, okay, yeah. Can we set up a time to talk?" She typed, "I don't do calls right now. Text or video with captions only. And yes." A pause. Then, "Done. Whatever works for you." She set the tablet down and looked at the whiteboard. What does it need to feel like? She picked up a marker and under the question wrote 4 new words. Like someone was there. She told Ethan about Marcus that night. She told him in a mixture of signs and notepad, the fluid switching between the two that she'd started doing without thinking about it. Signing what came naturally, writing what needed more precision. He listened, or watched rather, with the full attention she'd noticed he gave to everything she said. Not waiting for his turn to talk, actually listening. When she finished, he signed, "He sent you 12 pages of notes he'd been keeping on his own?" She nodded. He signed, "He was waiting for you to come back." She hadn't thought of it exactly that way. She had thought of it as Marcus being thorough. But she looked at Ethan's hands and understood that both things could be true simultaneously. She wrote, "I haven't been good at letting people wait for me. I'm usually the one who moves on." He signed, "That's not a bad trait. Depends what you do with it." She considered. Then she signed, "What do you do when someone's waiting for you and you don't know if you can be who they're waiting for anymore?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face, the way he got when a question touched something real, the slight inward pull of his attention. Then he signed, "You don't have to be who you were. You just have to show up as who you are now." She signed, "And if who you are now is still figuring out what that means, then you show up while you're figuring it out. That's the whole thing. That's all it is." She looked at him. She had told him 2 weeks ago now that she'd been thinking about stopping everything. She had signed it in this room, in the dark, to a man she hadn't known 3 weeks before that. And he had not flinched. He had asked her what the last thing was that felt like hers. She thought sometimes about what would have happened if he hadn't knocked on that door. If he had stayed on the other side of it, the way everyone else had, and let her go on drowning in the clean, well-funded silence her father had surrounded her with. She thought about it, and she didn't let herself sit in that thought too long, because she was not in that place anymore, and the point was not to go back and visit it. The point was the whiteboard. The point was Marcus's 12 pages. The point was the question in the center. What does it need to feel like? But she was aware, in the particular way you become aware of the things that are quietly changing your life, that she was different from the person who had been sitting in this room, staring at the window 4 weeks ago, and that the difference had a name. She signed, "Can I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "What do you want? For yourself, not for Gracie. For you." He blinked, like the question had come at an angle he hadn't been expecting. He was quiet for long enough that she wrote, "You don't have to answer." He shook his head slowly. He signed, "No, I'm just thinking about it. I don't get asked that a lot." A pause. "I want Gracie to be okay. I want to get through the next few years without—" He stopped. Started again. "After Claire died, I stopped thinking about what I wanted. I just thought about what needed to happen." She read his hands. She wrote, "That sounds exhausting." "It is. It also feels necessary. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at that. He read it twice. Then he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something shift behind his eyes that wasn't about her. Something that was entirely his, something he'd been carrying a long time, alone and without complaint. He signed, "No, they're not." The room held that for a moment. Then she signed, "You told me I was still in there. I'm telling you the same thing." He didn't answer right away, but the way he looked at her, the way a person looks when they haven't been seen in a long time, and someone finally looks directly at them, said enough. They sat together in the quiet that wasn't the grave anymore. That was just two people being honest in a room at 11 o'clock at night, and the city outside kept its lights on, and somewhere across town a 9-year-old girl named Gracie was asleep under a roof that her father held up alone. And the whiteboard on the wall said, "What does it need to feel like?" And under it, in Lydia's handwriting, the only answer that had ever been true: like someone was there. Victor Cross had not built a $12 billion company by missing things. He had missed things with his daughter. He knew that. He had known it for years, in the way successful men often know the things they've sacrificed. Distantly, theoretically, filed under, "I'll address that when the quarter closes." But in his professional life, in the world where he actually knew what he was doing, he missed almost nothing. So when he came in on a Tuesday evening and found the whiteboard covered in work, real work, structured and deliberate, the kind of diagramming Lydia used to do on the glass wall of her office, his first reaction was not joy. It was a question. He stood in front of it for a long time. He looked at the flow diagram on the left, the list of names on the right, the phrase in the center with 4 words written underneath it in a different session, a different pen. He looked at the notepad on the tray table, which had pages bent back, filled with notes in Lydia's handwriting. He looked at his daughter, who was sitting in the chair by the window, reading something on her tablet, with her chin up and her back straight, and he thought, something happened in this room that I don't know about. He sat down. Lydia looked up from the tablet, registered his face, and set the tablet in her lap. He pointed at the board and said, carefully and slowly so she could read his lips, "This is new." She nodded. He said, "When did this start?" She reached for the notepad. She wrote, "A few weeks ago." He read it. He looked at the board again. He said, "Did someone from the team come to see you?" She wrote, "No, it was my idea." He was quiet for a moment. He turned back to her. He said, "Lydia," and then stopped, because he could see from the set of her face that whatever he was about to say, she had already prepared for and was not going to receive the way he intended. He changed direction. He said slowly, "Are you sleeping?" She almost smiled. She wrote, "More than before." He nodded. He looked at the board one more time, and she could see him recalibrating. The way he did in board meetings when a report came in differently than he'd expected, and he had to update his model in real time. He was updating his model of her. She watched him do it and felt something complicated about it. Not resentment, not the old familiar exhaustion, but something closer to patience. She was learning patience in a way she never had before. She wasn't sure yet whether she liked it or just respected it. He said, "What do you need from me?" She wrote, without hesitating, "A meeting with the accessibility team, video, with real-time captions, not arranged through anyone else, directly to me." He read it. He nodded. "Done. I'll set it up for Thursday." She wrote, "And I want Marcus Webb on it." "Okay." "And I want to run it." A pause. Brief, barely visible, but she caught it. Then, "Okay." She wrote one more thing and turned the pad toward him. He leaned in to read it. "I'm not coming back the way I left. I'm coming back differently. I need to know if that's a problem." Victor Cross read that sentence, and something moved through his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the terror from 3 weeks ago. Not the managed concern of a man trying to hold everything together. Something older than that. Something that belonged to a father and not a CEO. He shook his head once. He said clearly, making sure she could read every word, "It's not a problem." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and turned back to her tablet. He sat with her for another hour that night. He didn't fill the silence with lip moving. He just sat, the way Ethan sat. And she thought about how strange it was that a janitor had taught her father something without ever being in the same room as him. Jerome was back on shift that night, which meant Ethan came to the door and saw the large, quiet man in the corner and paused. Lydia caught the movement in her peripheral vision and looked up. Ethan was at the door. The familiar lean, the mop hoisted, the face that asked without asking. He glanced at Jerome. Jerome glanced at him. Lydia wrote quickly on the notepad and held it up. "'K's okay." Ethan came in. He nodded at Jerome, who nodded back with the equanimity of a man unbothered by most things, and pulled his usual chair a few feet away from its corner position. Jerome looked at his phone. Ethan signed, "How is your father tonight?" She wrote, "Better, different." Then she signed, "I asked for a meeting with the team." He raised his eyebrows. "The work meeting?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, and she could see he was genuinely glad. Not in a performed way, but in the way someone is glad when a thing they hope for happens without them having to push it. He signed, "Thursday?" "Thursday." She paused. Then she signed, "He didn't argue." "No?" He just said, "Okay." She looked at her hands for a moment. "That's new." Ethan signed, "People change when they're scared enough for long enough, and then the thing they were scared of starts to ease up." She looked at him. She signed, "You sound like you've seen that before." "I've been scared enough for long enough," he said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way he said most true things. "When Claire was sick, the last year, I was so focused on managing the fear that I forgot to just..." He paused, hands finding the right sign. "Be there, without an agenda." She told me that. She told me once to just sit down and stop trying to fix it. Lydia signed, Did you? He smiled, but it was a complicated smile. Eventually. Not soon enough. A pause. But eventually. She wrote, I think my father is learning to sit down. Ethan looked at that. He nodded. That's worth something. They sat in the particular easy quiet that had become the signature of their late nights. The kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. And Lydia thought about the word eventually. About the things that came eventually, if you stayed long enough to let them. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep in the chair, which she hadn't done since before the accident. And when she woke, 40 minutes later, the room was the same, except that the tray table had been moved a few inches closer, and her blanket had been pulled up from where it had slipped off her lap. And Ethan was gone. And Jerome was still reading his phone, and the city was still lit up outside the window. Victor found out about Ethan on a Wednesday. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the way things happen in movies, with a confrontation staged and ready. It was the way things actually happen. Sideways, through a third party, in the middle of something else entirely. He was in the hallway outside room 412, speaking with the hospital's patient services coordinator about the Thursday meeting setup, when he looked through the narrow window in the door and saw his daughter laughing. Not smiling, laughing, her head tilting back slightly, her hand pressed to her mouth, her whole face changed by it. And across from her, in the corner chair, a man in a gray facilities uniform, with his hands moving. Victor stopped mid-sentence. The coordinator said something he didn't register. He watched through the window for a moment, watched Lydia's hands respond, watched the man in the chair nod and sign something back, watched his daughter sign again with a fluency that caught in his chest, because he hadn't seen her use sign language, hadn't known she'd been learning, hadn't known there was someone in this room she talked to like that. He excused himself from the coordinator and walked to the nurse's station. The charge nurse that evening was a woman named Beth, who had been on this ward for 11 years and had learned exactly what Victor Cross looked like when he wanted information. She looked at him with calm, steady eyes. He said, "Who is the man in my daughter's room?" She said, "Sir?" He said, "I'm not going to do anything. I want to know who he is." Beth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "His name is Ethan Moore. He's on the night facilities team. He checks on her during his rounds. It started a few weeks ago." Victor said, "Does the hospital know?" She met his eyes. "It's not against policy to speak with patients during rounds, Mr. Cross. And your daughter's chart," she chose her next words carefully, "your daughter's chart looks significantly different than it did 4 weeks ago." He looked at her. He said, "Different how?" She said, "The monitoring flags have been removed. Her psychiatrist signed off 2 weeks ago." The nursing staff notes describe a patient who is engaged and purposeful. A pause. 4 weeks ago, Mr. Cross, we were having a different kind of conversation about your daughter." He stood at the nurse's station for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Thank you," and walked back toward room 412. He knocked. Lydia looked up and saw her father in the door, and then saw him register Ethan in the chair, and she watched both things happen on his face in real time, the recognition, and then the particular stillness of a powerful man deciding how to respond to something he hadn't authorized. Victor came in. He nodded at Ethan in the measured way of a man maintaining composure. He looked at Lydia. He said slowly, "Can we talk?" She reached for the notepad. She wrote, "We are talking." He glanced at Ethan. He said, "Privately." Lydia looked at her father. She looked at Ethan. Ethan had straightened in the chair, not defensive, but present, in the way of someone who knew they might be asked to leave and had decided not to leave before being asked. He signed to Lydia. "I can go." She signed back without looking away from her father. "Stay." Victor caught the exchange, both the signs and the fact that she hadn't looked away from him to make it. He pulled the second chair to the opposite side of the room from Ethan and sat down. He looked at his daughter. He said, "How long?" She wrote, "5 weeks." He said, "Every night?" She wrote, "Most nights." He turned and looked at Ethan directly. He said, not loudly, but in the voice he used when he needed to be understood clearly, "What exactly is your interest in my daughter?" Ethan looked at him steadily. He said, "She was having a hard time. I noticed." Victor said, "You're a janitor." Ethan said, "Yes, sir." Victor said, "And you thought it was appropriate, Dad?" Both men looked at Lydia. She had spoken, not signed, not written, but said it out loud. The first word she'd said aloud in the room in Victor's presence in weeks. Rough from disuse, but clear. She couldn't hear herself say it. She felt it in her throat. She wrote, quickly, and turned the pad to face her father. "He didn't think about appropriate. He thought about what I needed. That's different." Victor read it. His jaw moved. She wrote more, turned the pad again. "You spent $4 million and not one of those people talked to me like I was still a person." He knocked on the door with a cup of tea and asked me if I was okay. That's it. That's all he did. Victor read it. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at his daughter. She wrote, "He's not after anything. I know the difference. I've spent my whole career knowing the difference." Ethan said, quietly, "Mr. Cross, I don't need you to trust me. But your daughter built that." He gestured at the whiteboard without looking at it. "In this room, in the last 5 weeks. Whatever you think about me, that has nothing to do with me. That's her." Victor looked at the whiteboard for a long time. He looked at the diagram, the list, the question in the center, the answer written underneath. He said, quietly, "Like someone was there." Ethan said, "She wrote that." Victor turned back to his daughter. He looked at her for a long time, really looked, the way he hadn't for longer than the 7 weeks in this hospital, longer than the accident, longer than most of the years she'd been running toward the same horizon he'd built, and that neither of them had ever stopped long enough to ask whether it was the right one. He said, and she could read every word because he said it slowly and directly for the first time in as long as she could remember. "I didn't know you were learning to sign." She looked at him. She wrote, "I didn't want to learn a new language. I wanted my old one back." A pause. Then she wrote on a new line, "But this one is mine now too." Victor said, "Will you teach me?" She looked at him. She hadn't expected that. She had expected the cross-examination to continue, the business meeting composure, the controlled re-evaluation. She had not expected that question, said with the uncertainty of a man who had built his whole life on competence and was asking to be a beginner. She wrote, "It takes a long time." He said, "I have time." She looked at her father, really looked, the way she had when she'd seen the terror in his face 3 weeks in. But this time what she saw was different. Not terror. Something quieter. Something that had been there under the terror the whole time, waiting for the terror to thin enough to show through. She wrote, "Start with this." She raised her right hand, palm facing her, and moved it in a small circle over her chest. Victor watched. He raised his own hand, uncertain, and imitated the motion. Slower, imprecise. The hand of a man doing something for the first time. She wrote, "That's sorry." He held the sign in the air for a moment. He looked at her face. And then he moved his hand again, still slow, still imprecise, and kept it going in that small, deliberate circle while he looked at his daughter. She watched him do it. She felt the thing in her chest that had been like a stone since the accident shift. Not dissolve, not vanish, but shift, settle into a different position, become something she could carry differently. Ethan was quiet in the corner, and she was glad he was there. She wrote, finally, "Again, slower, your wrist, not your whole arm." Victor adjusted. He tried again. She nodded. He said, carefully, watching her face to make sure she was reading him, "What's the sign for—" He paused. He gathered himself in the way of a man unaccustomed to asking for things. "What's the sign for, I love you?" She looked at him for a moment. She raised her hand, thumb, index finger, and pinky extended, the other fingers folded, and held it up. He looked at her hand. He raised his own. He formed the shape imperfectly, the ring finger not quite folded, but the intention unmistakable. She held up her own hand in the same sign. And they sat there, father and daughter, with their hands raised in a language she had learned alone in the dark, and he was just now beginning. And the whiteboard on the wall held its question, and the room held the particular hush of something being repaired. Ethan looked at the floor and gave them the privacy of his silence. He found Ethan in the hallway afterward, where Ethan had quietly stepped out during the last part of the exchange to give them space. Victor stood in front of him. He was a taller man than Ethan by 2 inches, broader, carrying the physical presence of someone who had been the largest thing in most of the rooms he'd entered for 30 years. Ethan stood his ground without making a performance of it. Victor said, "My daughter trusts you." Ethan said, "I know." Victor said, "She doesn't trust easily. She hasn't since she was about 22, and a VP she'd worked under for 3 years tried to take credit for a project she'd built from nothing." He paused. "I didn't handle that right either." Ethan didn't say anything. Victor said, "I'm not going to pretend I understand what happened in that room. I've spent 5 weeks trying everything I could think of, and you knocked on a door." He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." Ethan said, "Okay." Victor said, "What does she need that I haven't given her?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He respected the question enough not to answer it fast. Then he said, "To be in charge of her own recovery. You kept trying to solve it for her. She doesn't need you to solve it. She needs you to let her solve it and be there when she looks up." Victor said nothing. Ethan said, "She's the most capable person I've ever met, and I've been watching her figure out, from scratch, in a hospital room, how to rebuild everything she thought she lost. She doesn't need fixing, Mr. Cross. She needs witness." Victor looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Can you teach me the sign for thank you?" Ethan looked at him. Then, without any particular ceremony, he raised his flat hand to his chin and moved it forward. Victor watched. He raised his own hand. He touched his chin. He moved it forward. Ethan nodded. And Victor Cross, who had not taken instruction from anyone in 30 years, nodded back. The Thursday meeting happened at 2 in the afternoon in room 412, with a laptop propped on Lydia's tray table and 5 people on the screen whose faces she had not seen in nearly 2 months. Marcus Webb had set up the real-time captioning himself, not the hospital system, which lagged by 4 to 6 seconds and had a tendency to transcribe medical jargon as something approximating nonsense, but a custom setup he'd built over the previous 48 hours using a captioning API he'd integrated directly into the video platform. He had sent her a test message the night before. I tested it with 3 different accents, and it held up. If anything drifts, type X in the chat, and I'll fix it in real time. She had typed back, "You built this in 2 days?" He had written, "I've had it half built in my head for a year. I just needed a reason to finish it." She had sat with that for a while. When the meeting opened, and the 5 faces appeared on the screen. Marcus, the UX lead, Donna Park, 2 engineers she'd hired herself, and a product manager named Theo, who had been with the company since before Lydia joined. She had expected to feel the distance, the gap between who she'd been when she last saw these people and who she was now, sitting in a wheelchair in a hospital room with a whiteboard on the wall and hands that had learned to speak a new language. She felt it for about 30 seconds. Then Marcus said, through the captions, "We've been waiting for this meeting for 2 months. I can't speak for everyone, but I want to say, we're glad you called it." Donna Park nodded on screen. One of the engineers, a young woman named Priya, who had barely said 3 words in any meeting Lydia had ever run, typed directly into the chat. "Same. Really glad." Lydia looked at the screen. She typed, "Let's get into it. I've been looking at Marcus's notes, and I think we've been building the wrong product." Theo said something. The captions read, "Wrong how?" She typed, "We built it for a hypothetical user, someone whose only challenge is hearing loss in an otherwise undisturbed life. That person exists, but she's not the majority, and she's not who needs us most." She paused, then typed, "The real user is managing hearing loss plus mobility issues, or hearing loss plus cognitive fatigue from lip reading all day, or hearing loss that came with trauma and everything that comes with that. We need to build for her." The screen was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus said, and the captions caught every word, "That's what I've been trying to say for 8 months. I didn't have the language for it." Lydia typed, "I do now." The meeting ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than anyone had scheduled for, and by the end of it, the whiteboard on the wall had new diagrams. Lydia had been writing and wheeling back to the screen and writing again throughout, and Marcus had been screen sharing his own notes in real time, and at one point, Donna had laughed and said the captions read, "This is the most alive this project has felt since the beginning." After the others had signed off, Marcus stayed on screen, just the 2 of them. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She typed, "Go ahead." He said, "How did you know? What changed?" She looked at the question. She thought about a man in a gray uniform knocking on a door he wasn't sure he should knock on. She thought about a question asked on the 4th night. What was the last thing you did that felt like it was yours? She typed, "Someone asked me the right question at the right time." Marcus nodded slowly. He said, "Well, whatever it was, the project is better for it. You're better for it." He paused. "I don't mean that the way it might sound." She typed, "I know what you mean. Thank you, Marcus." He said, "Thank you for coming back," and signed off. She sat alone with the laptop and the whiteboard and the city outside the window, and she thought about coming back. About what it meant to come back not as who you were, but as who you were now. and whether those two people could eventually occupy the same space. She thought they probably could. She thought it probably took time. She thought she was more willing to give it time than she had ever been before. She picked up the notepad and wrote, for no one in particular, because sometimes writing is just thinking made visible. You don't come back. You arrive. Ethan came that night and she showed him the phrase. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he signed, "You should keep that one." She wrote, "I'm putting it on the board." He watched her wheel to the whiteboard and write it in the lower right corner, below the diagram and the list and the question and the answer. She wrote it smaller than the rest, the way you write something private, even when you put it where people can see it. She wheeled back and signed, "The meeting went well." He signed, "I know. You look different." She raised an eyebrow. Different how? He thought about it. Then he signed, like someone who remembered something they'd forgotten. She looked at her hands. She signed, "I think that's right." He signed, "What happens next with the project?" "Marcus is going to rebuild the navigation from the ground up. I'm going to consult remotely until—" She paused. "Until I'm not here anymore." She said it plainly, without the weight it would have carried 5 weeks ago. Not until I give up. Just until she left. He signed, "When do the doctors think that is?" 4 to 6 weeks. The spinal situation is— She chose her signs carefully. Complicated. They're more hopeful than they were. I'm not counting on anything. He nodded. He signed, "Are you okay with not counting on it?" She thought about that honestly. "I'm learning to be," she signed. "I keep thinking about what you said. About showing up while you're still figuring it out." A pause. "I figure that applies to walking, too." He signed, "It applies to everything." She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 5 weeks now, in this room, in the low light of the hospital night, and she had become familiar with his face in the way you become familiar with something you trust. Not perfectly known, not without mystery, but reliably itself. He was the same every night. That was not a small thing. She had learned, in this room, that consistency was a form of love. That showing up specifically, repeatedly, without requiring anything back, that was something people called ordinary, and was actually extraordinary. She signed, "I want you to bring Gracie sometime, if she'd be okay with it." He looked at her. She saw something move through his face. Surprise, and then something warmer than surprise. Something that had been careful for a long time, and was deciding whether it was safe to be less careful. He signed, "She'd love that. She's been asking about you." Lydia blinked. "She knows about me?" "I told her I'd been talking with someone at the hospital. She asked a lot of questions." He smiled. "She's 9. She asks a lot of questions about everything." She signed, "What did you tell her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he signed, "I told her I'd met someone who was going through something hard and was figuring out how to be brave about it." A pause. "She asked if you were my friend." Lydia looked at his hands. She signed, "What did you say?" He met her eyes. He signed, "I said yes." She held that word. Friend. It was not a complicated word. It was not a word that asked too much, or promised anything it couldn't keep. It was the right word for what had been built in this room over 5 weeks of late nights and tea and sign language and honesty passed back and forth in the dark, like something neither of them had intended to need so much. She signed, "Good." Gracie came on a Saturday afternoon. Lydia had been told by Ethan the night before. She'll want to sign with you. She's been practicing new signs all week. I'm not sure what she's planning. Lydia had written, "Should I be worried?" He had signed, "Probably a little." Gracie Moore was small for 9, with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness visible in the set of her mouth, even before she said anything. She came in holding Ethan's hand and immediately looked at the whiteboard with an expression of complete, unguarded fascination. She turned to Lydia and signed, quickly and with the confidence of someone who had been practicing. "My dad says you're the smartest person he's ever met." Lydia looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling. She signed back to Gracie carefully. "Your dad is being kind." Gracie signed, "He's not kind about things that aren't true. He gets annoyed when people say stuff that isn't true." She said this with the absolute certainty of a child reporting observable fact. "He told me once that honesty is a form of respect. He says it a lot, actually." Lydia signed, "He's right about that." Gracie looked at the whiteboard again. She pointed at the phrase in the lower right corner. She couldn't read it from where she stood, so she walked over to it, not asking permission, just going, the way 9-year-olds do, and read it out loud. Lydia couldn't hear her say it, but she watched her lips. "You don't come back. You arrive." Gracie turned around and signed, "Did you write that?" Lydia nodded. Gracie considered it with the seriousness of someone genuinely thinking about a thing. Then she signed, "I like it. It sounds like something that goes in a book." Lydia signed, "Maybe it will." Gracie came and sat in the chair that had become Ethan's chair, without ceremony, and looked at Lydia directly, the way children do when they have decided they like someone and don't see any reason not to show it. She signed, "Can I ask you something?" Lydia signed, "Yes." "Does it get easier, the not hearing?" The room held the question. Ethan was still standing near the door, and Lydia saw him go very still. She looked at Gracie's face, earnest and open and 9 years old, and also the face of a child who had watched her mother lose hearing and had learned to sign to keep talking to her, and had done it without being asked. This was not an abstract question. This was a child asking something she needed to know. Lydia signed, "Different. It gets different. Some days that's easier, and some days it isn't." She paused. Then she signed, "But you find new ways to hear things. You learn to listen with your eyes. And sometimes what you catch that way is more than what you would have caught the other way." Gracie thought about that. Then she signed, "My mom said something like that. She said when she stopped hearing music, she started feeling it more, like through the floor." Lydia looked at her. She signed, "Your mom sounds like she was right about a lot of things." Gracie nodded. She was. A pause. The first time the easy directness had slowed. Then, "I miss her." Lydia signed, "I know." She meant it the way you can only mean something when you have sat with your own version of it. Gracie nodded again. She straightened up in the chair. She signed, "Okay. Can you teach me a new sign? Dad knows all my signs now, and I need harder ones." Lydia looked at Ethan, who spread his hands in a gesture that said, "This is entirely your problem now," and was trying not to smile. She signed to Gracie, "What do you want to say?" Gracie thought with her whole face. Then she signed, "Resilience. I want to know how to sign resilience." Ethan made a sound. Lydia looked at him. He had the expression of a man who was not going to be able to maintain composure if he wasn't careful. She turned back to Gracie and signed the word. She showed her the motion twice, slowly, then watched her practice it. Gracie got it on the third try. She signed it once more, to herself, and nodded with satisfaction. Then she looked at Lydia and signed, "I think you have a lot of it." Lydia looked at this 9-year-old girl who had learned to sign for her dying mother, and asked direct questions, and walked up to whiteboards without asking permission, and practiced the word resilience in her spare time. And she felt something close to undone. Not in the grief way, not the way she'd been undone in this room before, but in the way of something coming loose that had been held too tight for too long. She signed, "So do you." Victor met Gracie in the hallway as she and Ethan were leaving. It was not planned. Victor had come for his 6 o'clock visit and arrived to find Ethan and his daughter in the corridor, Gracie still signing something to her father with the focused energy of a child finishing a thought. Victor stopped. Ethan looked up. The two men looked at each other. Gracie looked between them with the calculating attention of a child who understands more than adults expect. Victor said, "You must be Gracie." Gracie said, "Yes, sir." Then she signed it to Ethan simultaneously, the automatic bilingualism of a child who had been doing this since before she understood why. Victor watched her sign. He looked at Ethan. He said, "She's fluent." Ethan said, "She's better than I am." Victor looked at Gracie again with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of something. He said, slowly, "Will you teach me something, since I'm just starting out?" Gracie looked at her father. Ethan gave the smallest nod. She looked back at Victor. She signed and spoke simultaneously for his benefit, the word she had just asked Lydia to teach her. Victor watched her hands. He said, "What is that?" Gracie said, "Resilience." Victor looked at the sign. He looked at the man standing beside this child. He looked down the hallway toward room 412, where his daughter was. He said, "Can you show me that again?" Gracie showed him. He practiced it twice, slowly, his large hands uncertain with the motion. Gracie watched him with the patience of a teacher who has decided her student is worth the effort. She said, "Your wrist needs to be looser." Ethan made a sound that was not quite a cough. Victor adjusted. He tried again. Gracie nodded with the solemn authority of someone granting hard-won approval. Victor said, "Thank you." Gracie said, "You're welcome, sir." Then she took her father's hand. They walked down the hallway, and Victor watched them go. A man in a gray uniform and a small girl with her mother's stubbornness and a vocabulary that included the word resilience. And he stood there for a moment before going in to see his daughter, holding the sign in his hands without performing it, just holding it, the way you hold something new when you are not sure yet whether you deserve to keep it. Lydia noticed the change in him that evening. He was quieter than usual. Not the managed quiet of a man maintaining composure, but the genuine quiet of a man thinking something through. He sat in the chair and watched her finish a notation on the whiteboard, and didn't try to fill the space. She wheeled back and wrote, "You met Gracie." He nodded. She wrote, "She's something, isn't she?" He said, "She taught me a sign in the hallway." He raised his hands, uncertain, still learning, and formed the word she'd shown him. His wrist was looser than it had been. Lydia looked at his hands. She wrote, "Resilience." He said, "Yes." And then, after a pause, she said, "You have a lot of it." Lydia looked at her father's face. She looked at his hands, still holding the shape of the sign. She thought about every version of the conversation they had never managed to have, across board tables and dinner tables and the space of a hospital room, and 34 years of two people who loved each other in a language they'd never quite aligned on. She wrote, I learned it from somewhere. He read it. She watched him understand that she meant him, not completely, not without complication, but in the partial, true way that children inherit things from their parents without meaning to, and only recognize it later. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and made the small, deliberate circle on his chest that she had taught him in this room 2 weeks ago. She watched him sign it. She signed it back. And the room held them both, father and daughter, two people learning new languages at 61 and 34, in a hospital room that had been a near grave and was now something else entirely. Something neither of them had a word for yet in any language, but that both of them recognized as the beginning of something they were no longer willing to let go without a fight. Outside, the city kept its lights on. Somewhere across it, a 9-year-old girl was in a car, practicing a sign she'd learned that afternoon, her small hands moving in the dark on the way home, saying, "Resilience, resilience, resilience," to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. The discharge papers came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the whiteboard went up. Lydia had known they were coming. The doctors had been preparing her for the transition for 2 weeks, speaking about outpatient PT and home modifications and follow-up care in the measured tones of people who have learned not to promise more than the body can deliver. The spinal situation had improved enough, not resolved, not the clean ending anyone had hoped for in the early weeks. She still could not walk without support. The neurologist had said, "We remain cautiously optimistic," with the careful precision of a man who had seen cautious optimism go both ways too many times to be reckless with it. She had written on the notepad, "What does cautiously optimistic mean in practical terms?" He had said, "It means keep doing the work and don't make any decisions based on worst-case assumptions." She had looked at that for a moment. Then she wrote, "That's good advice for most things." He had smiled in the way doctors do when a patient says something that reminds them why they went to medical school. But the discharge papers meant leaving. And leaving meant the end of the particular world that had been built in room 412. The whiteboard, the late nights, the 2 cups of tea, the city outside the window that had gone from being a thing she was tired of looking at to being a thing she was actually looking forward to being part of again. It meant the end of Ethan coming at 10:45. She sat with the papers in her lap and thought about that. She told him that night. He came at his usual time, took one look at her face, and signed before he even sat down. What happened? She held up the discharge folder. He sat down. He looked at it. He signed. When? Friday. He nodded slowly. She watched him take it in, not with the performance of someone managing their reaction, but genuinely absorbing it, the way a person absorbs news that changes the shape of the immediate future. He signed, "How do you feel about it?" She wrote, "Because this felt like a writing moment. Terrified. Ready. Both at the same time." He read it. He signed, "That sounds about right." She wrote, "I've been thinking about what comes next. The project. The company." She paused, pen on the pad. "Other things." He signed, "Other things like what?" She looked at him. She put the pen down. She signed, slowly and deliberately, the way she signed things she had thought about carefully. Like whether the person I talk to every night at 10:45 is going to keep talking to me when I'm not in a hospital room. The air in the room changed. Not dramatically. No sudden intake of breath, no cinematic pause, just the specific quality of attention that comes when something true has been said out loud for the first time and both people in the room know it. Ethan looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the uncertain quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, but the careful quiet of someone who wanted to say the right thing and understood what was at stake in the difference. He signed, "I've been thinking about that too." She signed, "And?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the posture he took when he was being most honest. He signed, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound." She waited. He signed, "When I started coming here, I told myself it was because I recognized something. Because I'd seen that look, the one you had, and I knew what it meant, and I couldn't walk past it." That was true. He paused. What I didn't expect was everything after that. She held his gaze. He signed, "I haven't felt like myself since Claire died. I felt like a function, a father and a provider, and someone who gets through the week. And then I came into this room, and you asked me what I wanted for myself, and I realized I didn't have an answer." Another pause. "I still don't have a full answer, but I know that whatever I want, it looks like this. Like the person I am in this room." She felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not the fragile almost something of the early weeks, but something with weight. Something that had been built slowly. The way things built slowly tend to hold. She signed, "You told Gracie I was your friend." He signed, "You are." She signed, "Is that all?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he signed, "No. But I'm aware that I'm a janitor, and you're—" He gestured vaguely in the direction of the whiteboard, the folder, the company, the $12 billion, and everything it implied. She signed back, and her hands were steady. "Don't." He stopped. She signed, "You walked into this room when I was deciding to stop. Everything I am right now, the project, the meeting, the whiteboard, every single thing, started with you knocking on a door you weren't sure you should knock on. So don't you sit here and make yourself small in front of me. I won't accept it." He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He signed, "Okay." She signed, "Okay." The room held them in its particular quiet, and neither of them looked away. She told her father the next evening. Not about the conversation exactly, not the signs they'd exchanged or the specific words about what Ethan was and wasn't, but about the fact of it, about what she felt and why she felt it, and what she intended to do about it. She had spent 34 years being precise in board meetings and vague about the things that mattered personally, and she had decided, somewhere in the last few months, that she was finished with that particular habit. Victor listened. He was in the chair, coat on, the way he'd been every evening for 2 months now. And he listened, the way he had slowly learned to listen, with his whole face, without reaching for the next response while she was still in the middle of the current one. When she finished writing, he read it. He read it again. He put the notepad on the tray table and looked at his daughter. He said, slowly, "What do you need from me?" She wrote, "I need you to not make this about the company or the optics or anything other than what it is." He said, "And what is it?" She looked at him. She wrote, "Someone showed up for me, in the specific way I needed, at the specific moment I needed it, without being asked, and without wanting anything back. That's not nothing. That's not something I'm going to walk away from because it doesn't fit a particular shape." Victor read it. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to brace for the version of him she'd been bracing for her whole life. The CEO version. The risk assessment version. The man who had built everything he had by knowing when something didn't pencil out. Then he said, "When your mother and I first met, I was 23 years old and working out of a garage, and she was finishing her master's degree, and every single person in her family told her it didn't make sense. He paused. She told them she wasn't interested in sense. She was interested in the person. Lydia looked at her father. He said, "She was right. She was right about most things." He looked at his hands. "I should have told her that more." She wrote, "You can still tell her." He looked up. She was watching him with the expression she'd had since she was small. The one that saw through the composure, past the CEO, all the way to the man underneath who had always been doing his best and not always known what his best looked like. He nodded. He raised his hand and made the sign she'd taught him in the first week. Still imperfect, still unmistakable. "Sorry." She signed it back. And between them, in the language they were both still learning, something that had been broken for a long time finished the first stage of its repair. Ethan came that night, and she told him about the conversation. He listened. He signed, "What did he say?" She wrote, "He told me about my mother, when they met." She looked at what she'd written. "He's never told me that story before." Ethan was quiet. Then he signed, "People hold things until they understand why they matter." She signed, "He's changing." "So are you." She looked at him. She signed, "I know. I just mean, I thought this was the hardest thing that ever happened to me." A pause. "I think it might also be the most important." He signed, "Those aren't always different things." She picked up the notepad. She wrote something and held it up. "Come to the discharge on Friday. I want you there." He read it. He looked at her face. He signed, "I'll be there." She wrote, "Bring Gracie." He looked at the words. Something moved through his face that she had come to recognize as the expression he wore when something exceeded what he'd allowed himself to hope for. He nodded. She wrote one more line. "And Ethan, wear something that isn't gray." He laughed. The real one, unguarded. The laugh she decided on the first night she heard it that she wanted to keep hearing. He signed, "I own one other color." She wrote, "What color?" He signed, "Navy." She wrote, "That'll do." Friday came the way Tuesdays and Wednesdays had come, with the indifferent, unhurried momentum of time that has no investment in what you make of it. Lydia was packed and ready by 9 in the morning. The whiteboard had been photographed. Marcus had sent a wide-angle camera specifically so she could document the whole thing before it was dismantled. And the photographs had been saved to 3 separate cloud folders because Lydia had learned enough about the impermanence of things not to trust a single backup. The phrases were still on the board, the diagram, the list. What does it need to feel like? Like someone was there. You don't come back. You arrive. She would have the board taken to her home office. She had already decided. Victor arrived at 10 with 2 people from his team to manage the logistics of the transfer. The wheelchair-accessible vehicle, the equipment, the documents. He looked at the whiteboard before anything else. He stood in front of it, the way he had the first night he'd noticed it, but differently. Not with the evaluating distance of a man trying to understand something, but with the recognizing stillness of someone who already does. He turned to Lydia and signed, imperfectly, with the wrist loosening slightly better each time. "Ready?" She signed back, "Almost." Ethan arrived at 10:15 with Gracie. He was wearing navy, a simple collared shirt, navy, tucked in, the most dressed up she had ever seen him. Gracie was in a yellow dress and had clearly been told to let her hair be done, and had equally clearly negotiated some compromise on the subject, because half of it was neat and half of it was doing something independent. Gracie came directly to Lydia and signed, without preamble, "You're leaving." Lydia signed, "I'm leaving the hospital, not leaving." Gracie considered the distinction with the rigor it deserved. Then she signed, "Okay, are we going to keep seeing you?" Lydia looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man whose 9-year-old had once again conducted a negotiation he hadn't authorized. She signed to Gracie, "Yes." Gracie nodded, satisfied, and went to look at the whiteboard. Victor approached Ethan. The two men stood beside each other in the room that had held so much over the past months, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two men who had reached an understanding through the long route, through confusion and resistance, and the gradual erosion of certainty that cleared the way for something more honest. Victor said, "I owe you something I don't know how to repay." Ethan said, "You don't owe me anything." Victor said, "My daughter was—" He stopped. He tried again. "She was in a place that I couldn't reach her from. I had every resource available and I couldn't reach her. You reached her with a cup of tea and a conversation." Ethan said, "She reached herself. I just showed up." Victor looked at him. He said, "Don't undersell that." A pause. "I've spent 30 years in boardrooms full of people who showed up when there was something in it for them. You showed up because it was the right thing." He extended his hand. Ethan looked at the hand. He shook it. Victor said, "I want to talk to you. Not today. Today is for her. But I want to talk to you about the accessibility initiative she's building. I want you involved." Ethan said, "I mop floors for a living." Victor said, "You know more about what this product needs to feel like than anyone I have on staff." He used her phrase without apparent self-consciousness. "I'd be an idiot not to use that." Ethan said, "I'd need to think about it." Victor said, "Take your time." And there was something in the way he said it, the genuine, unhurried patience of a man learning, in his 7th decade, that time is not always the enemy, that Ethan received and did not argue with. Gracie had come away from the whiteboard and was standing beside her father. She looked up at Victor. She signed and spoke. "My dad is good at a lot of things that people don't notice." Victor looked down at her. He said, "I noticed." Gracie seemed to find this acceptable. She took her father's hand. They moved Lydia out at 11. She came out of room 412 in the wheelchair, her bag on her lap, the rolled photographs of the whiteboard tucked beside her, and she moved through the hallway she had not been in since before the accident. The ward was doing what wards do. Nurses moving, equipment rolling, the general ongoing hum of a place where people are in the middle of the hardest things of their lives, and other people are trying to help them through it. She noticed Sandra at the nurses' station and raised her hand. Sandra raised hers back. She noticed Beth, the charge nurse, and Beth said something she caught the end of. "Going to miss you in there." And she nodded in a way that meant, "I know, me too." Not the being in there, but what happened in there. Ethan walked beside her chair. Gracie was on her other side, having inserted herself into this position without being asked. Victor walked slightly behind, and he had his phone out and was looking at the ASL dictionary app he had downloaded 2 weeks ago, with the same focused determination he brought to quarterly reports. At the elevator, Lydia stopped. She turned the chair and looked back down the hallway at room 412. The door was closed. From here it was just a door, the same as all the other doors on the ward. The same painted wood and narrow window. Nothing to indicate that what had happened behind it was anything other than the ordinary mechanics of recovery. She looked at it for a long moment. Ethan signed quietly. "You okay?" She signed back. "Yes." Then she looked at him. She signed, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He nodded. She signed, "I came into this hospital, and I wanted to stop. I had decided. And then you knocked on a door you weren't sure you should knock on, and you asked me 2 signs, and I answered. And that was the first real thing I'd said to anyone in 3 weeks." She paused. "I built everything that comes next on that. The project, my relationship with my father, the fact that I'm leaving this building alive and ready instead of—" She didn't finish that sign. She didn't need to. "I need you to know that. Not because you need credit. Because you need to know you did that. That you did something that mattered in a way that most people never get to." Ethan looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He was doing the thing he did, the real listening, all the way in, without reserve. He signed, "Can I say something now?" She nodded. He signed, "You did it. I knocked on a door. You opened it. Everything after that was you." A pause. "But I need you to know something too." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I've been walking through my life for 3 years managing, getting through, keeping the lights on for Gracie and not asking for anything more than that because I didn't think I was allowed to want more than that." He signed it carefully. "And then I knocked on a door, and I found someone who looked right at me and asked me what I wanted, and actually waited for the answer." He met her eyes. "You did that for me, the same as I did it for you. I need you to know that." Gracie was looking between them with the wide-eyed attention of a child who understands that she is witnessing something significant and has correctly assessed that this is not the moment to ask questions. Victor had put the phone away. Lydia looked at Ethan Moore, this man in his navy shirt who mopped floors at night and raised his daughter alone, and had learned a language to talk to his dying wife, and had not made himself small in any of the ways the world gives people reasons to make themselves small. And she felt the complete, clear, unhurried certainty of someone who has done enough surviving to know the difference between what matters and what doesn't. She raised her hand, not to sign, just the hand she'd extended toward him, palm up, in the space between them. He looked at it. He looked at her face. He put his hand in hers. Gracie made a small sound that was either surprise or satisfaction. It was genuinely difficult to tell. And Victor looked at the elevator buttons with the deliberate attention of a man who has learned when to give people space. The Accessibility Initiative launched 8 months later under a name Lydia had chosen herself. Present tense. The tagline, written by no one on the marketing team but by Lydia at 2 in the morning in her home office with a whiteboard on the wall behind her, read, "Design for who you actually are, right now." Marcus Webb led the engineering team. Donna Park rebuilt the UX from the ground up with a cohort of deaf and hard-of-hearing consultants, real users, people with full lives and complicated circumstances, not the hypothetical average user who had never actually existed. The navigation felt different from anything the company had built before. It felt like someone had been there. At the launch presentation, Lydia spoke. She signed with a live interpreter, and the captions ran on every screen in the room. She had written the presentation herself, and practiced it until the signs came as naturally as her spoken words ever had. She said, "When I was rebuilding this product, someone asked me what it needed to feel like. My answer was, like someone was there." She paused. "I know what it feels like when no one is there. I also know what it feels like when someone shows up. Not because it's their job, not because there's anything in it for them, but because they looked at another person and decided that person mattered." Another pause. That is what this product is. It is designed by people who decided you matter. Not the average version of you, not the version that's easiest to build for. You. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something true has been said in them. Victor was in the front row. He had his hands in his lap, and he was doing something she recognized. The small, subtle motion of someone practicing a sign without performing it, running through the shapes of a language they are still learning, committing it to muscle memory, the way you commit something you intend to keep. Ethan was in the third row with Gracie, who was wearing a blue dress and had, by the evidence available, won the hair negotiation entirely. She was watching her father watch Lydia, with the expression of a child who has understood something about the adults in her life that she will only be able to name years from now. Ethan was watching Lydia with the expression she had come to know as his, open, steady, entirely present, the face of a man who had learned that showing up was not a small thing, and had decided to keep doing it. She finished the presentation. The room came back to life around her. Applause, movement, the specific energy of something new beginning. She moved through it in her chair, fielding the hands extended toward her, the words directed at her face so she could read them. The genuine enthusiasm of people who believed in what had just been announced. She made her way to Ethan. He signed, "You were good." She signed, "I was terrified." He signed, "You were good anyway." Gracie pulled on her father's sleeve and signed, "Can I go look at the product demo?" He signed, "Stay where I can see you." She was already moving. Lydia watched her go. This girl who had practiced the word resilience in the dark on the way home, and asked hard questions without apology, and learned to sign for her mother, and was now 9 years old and navigating a product launch with the confidence of someone twice her age. And she thought about everything that had led to this room, this moment, this version of a life she had not been able to imagine from a hospital room 8 months ago. Ethan signed, "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. She signed, "That I arrived." He understood. He had been there the night she wrote it. He had watched her wheel to the whiteboard and put it there in the lower right corner, in the small handwriting she used for things that were private and important. "You don't come back. You arrive." He signed, "You did." She signed, "We did." He looked at her. He took her hand the way he had in the elevator, unhurried, certain, without requiring the moment to be more than what it was, which was already enough. And Lydia Cross, who had once sat in a darkened hospital room and decided she was done, who had thrown a tablet against a wall and turned her face away from everyone who tried to reach her, who had learned a new language alone in the dark and used 2 signs to answer a stranger at a door, and built everything she was now from that single moment of choosing to respond. Lydia Cross held on. She was 34 years old and deaf and in a wheelchair, and leading the most important work of her career, and in love with a man who mopped floors and told his daughter the truth, and had knocked on a door he wasn't sure he should knock on. She had not come back from the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She had arrived at something better. And she had no intention of letting go.